Welcome to the Commonwealth Club. I'm George Hammond, Chair of the Humanities Program, which organized tonight's event, along with the tech staff at the Commonwealth Club, to bring you another virtual online program. And I'd like to welcome our audiences that are listening later as well. It's my great pleasure to first meet and also introduce Tamim Ansari, the author of many books, but the last two, Destiny Disrupted and The Invention of Yesterday, really a fascinating look at the big overarching ideas that run through history. So my first question for you, Tamim, is how did you get interested in such the big ideas, going back and trying to see the patterns in all of human history? It's really quite an undertaking.
Well, part of this, I come to it sort of happenstance because I was a textbook editor and then a textbook writer, and a lot of the work I did as a freelance textbook writer, I did for high school world history programs. And, I would research deeply whatever my assignment was, but the assignments were somewhat random. It's what somebody needed a writer, and they'd call me up and say, could you, write a chapter about ancient empires of Mesopotamia? And here's what we want you to cover. And here's like 16 books you should probably read. And then the next week, it would be someone saying, Industrial Revolution in Belgium. What was that all about? 30 pages. So the point about that is that it sort of exposed me to a web work of things that seemingly were unrelated.
Mm-hmm.
So, but being intensely at work on this just to make a living and put a roof over my head,
right.
It was, it sort of, it came to my attention that there are interesting and perhaps little noticed connections between things that are happening in different parts of the world. So that's one of the things that brought me to the kinds of things I write about. But I think the other part of it actually goes all the way back to when I was a kid. It's like, as I mentioned in Destiny Disrupted, when I was 8 or 9 or 10 years old, something like that, I met Arnold Toynbee. He came to my little town in Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
And he gave me this book, The Story of Mankind. And I was like, whoa, the story of mankind, so I'm part of mankind. So what? We have a story?
We have a lot of stories, don't we?
So that was one of the things that it lit a little spark in me all the way back then. And I was interested in reading history from then on. I just read a lot of it. But I'd say there's a third thing that's fed into the kinds of things I write about, and that is the happenstance that I was born in Afghanistan. My mother was the first American woman to marry an Afghan and go live there, and so the circumstances of my growing up were that I was living partly in one world and partly in another world, and I was not only in a position to experience and realize, but unable to not be in that position of realizing that there were two whole, complete realities, and that to some extent, people in each reality thought theirs was reality and the other was a interesting subtopic of reality.
Right. You call them peripheral people. I mean, out on the periphery. And I thought it was a great way of saying it, because we all look at ourselves as the center of the universe, and then we all look at our culture as the center of the universe, and everything else is just kind of supporting cast, as you said in another place. I thought another good way of putting it.
But it isn't just the peripheralness, because that part of it is like that New Yorker cartoon that shows the America, and Broadway takes up fourth of the screen, and so and all the rest of the. So there is that thing, but I think what I was experiencing and knowing from an early age was that each of these worlds was a coherent whole world in itself that included all of the rest of the worlds. It's like they were there, but they didn't register from this framework the way they did from within their own framework. And since I was not in one framework or the other, or rather, I was in both, uh, I was in a position to be unhooked from the idea of there being an absolute truth.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and I find that when I look back at what I've written, the thing that interests me is what happens in those areas where civilizations overlap, so that there's both
Mm-hmm.
civilizations are operating at the same time, and that's happening, of course, more and more in the world now. So that is kind of the story of the world.
Yeah, and I was thinking the same thing while you were telling that story, that that should make us all very optimistic for more knowledge and more understanding in the future, because now, I mean, you were in the first wave of this kind of intermarriage, but now there's lots of new scholars, all of whom have mixed backgrounds, and California is like that all by itself, as you said, where the cultures merge. So we should have thousands and thousands of scholars taking a bigger approach like that. Before we go into the four civilizations, river civilizations, which you start with, I thought it was very interesting what you said about money, that money started off to take the place of credits and debits in the trading civilizations because it was too clumsy to do credits and debits. And my question about that is, now that it's no longer clumsy to just do credits and debits because we have computers, is money going to disappear again, and we're going to go back to the credits and debits approach, but it's just going to be accounts in the computers?
Well, one of the things that interests me is that in the course of history, I think there are periods of time, uh, maybe not globally, but periods of time in whole societies in which money jumps to a new level of abstraction.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Of course, the least abstract level will be when there isn't money and you're a little community in and of separate from everything else, and value is the thing you use. You eat barley, so barley has some value. Uh, Even gold and silver is more abstract.
Mm-hmm.
Even that's usually we think of that as like, that's real money. But actually, if you were in the Sahara Desert and you were dying of thirst, and you could choose between a glass of water and a pound of gold, I
Mm-hmm.
think I know which one you choose.
Yeah.
Which would have more value. So even gold and silver is a level of abstraction. And then when you get to that time in history when the complicated network of trade relationships generates banknotes. Now that's an interestingly more abstract thing. Somebody's supposed to look at this piece of paper and say, okay, this is worth so and this amount, and I trust that it is. And when I think about right now, yes, it's true, computers, and we can do the accounting and stuff, but there are so many instruments of money-like value that are so abstract that I don't get them, at all.
Yeah.
Credit swap derivatives, and I sort of understand future options. I'm a very primitive caveman sort of thing, so that's about as far as I've gotten. Bitcoin, that it's like I don't understand that at all.
I think the
And
people in Las Vegas understand Bitcoin.
well, when I first began to hear about it, people would tell me, "Yeah, I bought this much Bitcoin because I believe it's going up." And I was like, "What's Bitcoin, and why is it going up? How is that?" So, money is an instrument of the interrelationship of people operating in the real world.
I thought it was, in your book, your whole description of how the Knights Templar turned into banks, how then they didn't have to move the physical asset because they just corresponded back and forth, and then how that eventually turned into banknotes. That was I think, a very good testament both to the clarity with which you write, but also the enthusiasm with which you write when you find a pattern, because you don't have to be an economist to like that description. That description's very clear. So I thought that was great. That's why I wanted to bring money up first, besides everyone likes money. So let's go now. Your book, The Invention of Yesterday, says to last 50,000 years, but we'll skip the first 45,000 and let people read about that. And we'll go to about 5,000 years ago. I find it interesting that about that time, history started. Not that recorded history started. There's always been history. But people began to be a little bit better off enough so that they began to pay attention to what had happened, what it had accomplished. Can we learn from it instead of just being in survival mode? So in that time period, you say there basically were 4 river civilizations, and the character of the river influenced the character of those 4 civilizations. If you want to tell a little bit about those, because I think that was a great, nice base for human civilization in the current time.
Well, the fundamental point there and the mystery is uh, river civilizations is generally acknowledged to be one of the one of the foundational generators of civilization and of culture,
Mm-hmm.
and it's because rivers bring reliable water. These 4 rivers deposit this alluvial soil that's fertile, and then people can irrigate the lands if they can only put in the infrastructure to hoard the water and let it down through canals.
Mm-hmm.
And every year they get more fertile soil so they can grow their crops. That's what we have known for a long time. The question that comes to me is these 4 rivers that we're talking about. There's probably other ones that the cultures did not prosper and grow, but these 4 we're talking about is the Huanghe, or Huanghe, which is the river in China, and the Indus River, and the Tigris, Euphrates, and the Niles. Well, those are the seeds of very different cultures. And how is it that the same geographical fact generates such different human ideas about God and all this sort of stuff?
Mm-hmm.
And so, this is one of those assignments I had, right about the first empires, and I'm
Uh-huh.
looking at this, and what I'm realizing is, yeah, but the rivers are not just the same. There is actually crucial geographical differences between those rivers, and interestingly enough, you can see a relationship between the geographical features of that river
Mm-hmm.
and the sort of culture that developed there. I would say let's just look at the Nile River and the Tigris Euphrates. One of the really significant things about the Nile River is that the last 600 miles of that river flowing north, uh, it doesn't have waterfalls, it doesn't have cataracts, doesn't have all that stuff. It's just this great big steady current flowing through a valley that's similar all along the way, and in which the the current is reliably moving north, and the breeze over that current is reliably blowing south,
Mm-hmm.
so that it was easy for people to just put a boat in the river, and if they put the sail up, they go one direction. If they take the sail down, they go in the other direction. And and what you discover is that there is a monolithic sort of culture that develops all along the 600 miles of that river, roughly 400, 600, however many you would,
Mm-hmm.
what the exact number is. So you have this culture that is very similar and is very interconnected and is all along this valley, and is also influenced by the fact that uh, it's got desert on both sides and big cataracts on one side, so it's just like so safe. But if you go to the Tigris Euphrates, they're not surrounded by walls and defenses. They can be got at from every side, and the river is not one big flowing interconnected or connected all up and down. It has connected parts, and then rapids, and then weedy parts, and then connected parts. And you find that along that river system, you have these separate little empires growing up,
Mm-hmm.
and each little empire builds walls around. They emerge as little walled cities. Of course they do, because that geography is always open to attack from the nomads on all sides.
Mm-hmm.
They create themselves the hills and cliffs that nature didn't give them. And then all of that has consequences historically. Then the story unfolds from there.
Yeah. Well, it's great you laid that basis down. And so the 4 are the Egyptian Empire and the Mesopotamian area, the Indus River in India, and then China, the Yellow River, or Hongyi.
Yeah.
So then later on, when you take, we're going to jump around a little bit, but you talk about Rome, obviously, and Greece. And I liked how you described Rome. You said that Rome was Greece minus the philosophers and plus the engineers in concrete. That's a very nice description of the difference. But what was it about this culture, and which were they connected to? You often connect it to different things between those cultures, and you talk a lot. Well, we're going to talk a little bit later too about the narrative that a culture creates and how it meshes or doesn't mesh. But Rome, is Rome part of the nomadic tribes? Your idea that there are these nomadic tribes up above the urban civilizations, or was it just a movement of the Mesopotamian culture over to Rome?
Well, exactly how Rome emerged as a civilization, I don't quite know. They think that the inhabitants both of Greece and Rome, and there's going to be people who dispute this because you're going on you're talking about a time when there's no written records of that.
Right.
But the I would say the mainstream idea is that there was this migration out of the Central Eurasian steppes, and it went wherever the east and west, as far as there was no barrier. When barriers turned up, then they went south. And so these whoever they were, the phrase Indo-European is the one that's commonly attached to these migrations. But whoever they were, they spread across a belt of northern terrain and then came south. So some came south into what is now Pakistan, some came south into what is now Greece, some came south into what is now Italy. And presumably that's where the ethnic origins of Rome. Their own stories say that they came from the embattled city of Troy when it fell to the Greeks. Aeneas, the hero of the Trojan Wars, got out of the burning city and he came to Rome. So there's evidently some ancestral connection between those two cultures. I think you haven't asked about this, but when you look at the mythologies of let's say the Iranians and of the Greeks and of the Romans, there is something very similar about it. It's not just the language. Deus is God in one language, and Zeus is the name for God someplace else. But it's also this, for example, this narrative that the old gods, they had children, and then they were afraid of their children, so they tried to kill them, and then the children revolted and imprisoned the old gods, and the present gods are these children. That's essentially the story that you have about the gods in Iran, and that's the story that you have about the gods in Greece. The giants, the Titans were the old gods, and then you have the Olympian gods. Then you go up north to the Norse gods. They have the same essential story. You don't find that story, for example, in China, and you don't find it really in southern India.
So it's like the King Lear story, actually. So not too
well. It's something that obviously originated somehow.
Yeah.
There was some ancestral connection there.
Well, it's interesting because when we're studying these ways of looking at history when we have no written record, there's so many different ways to go at it. There's the archaeological studies. There's the linguistic studies, as you said, that got really big in the 19th century and showed that Sanskrit and ancient Greek and Latin were all linguistically related. There's DNA studies. So it's interesting to take all those different ways of looking at it and try to come up with a coherent narrative. But I think that narrative sounds like what we believe must have happened because all those things seem to coalesce around that same sort of narrative. And we all know that whatever the story was that was told is obviously hiding something that really happened.
Yeah, and we can never really, dead bang know what happened back there. It's still part of our spinning a narrative we're trying to live inside of.
Yeah. All right. So let's go to the Chinese. the culture that came up about around what we call the Yellow River in English, and there were so many different times when it was disorderly and a very large number of different warlords, that kind of thing. And we've seen that even in the 19th, early 20th century, the same thing happened. And then Mao Zedong came in. And I thought you had a great analogy, because if you just tell the stories of the three main, and their time frame, the three main emperors that put things back together again, and then tell the story of Mao, and I think it will sound very familiar.
Well, the interesting thing about Mao is that in our experience of Mao, because of the historical moment that we were in, we really completely connected him to Marx and Lenin and the experience of communism rising, trying to solve the problems generated by industrialism. So we thought of Mao as being, just a Karl Marx point two or something.
Yeah.
But when you look at the career of Mao, you find that it has interesting echoes of the first emperor of China, Shi Huangdi, or there's different names that they have for that guy, but around 2 centuries BCE, he was one of many little kingdoms. He erupted, he conquered all the other kingdoms, and he became, the emperor of one big kingdom. And then he did this thing that was so characteristic of Chinese history. He launched massive infrastructure programs. He built the Great Wall. It's like he connected a whole bunch of little walls into this Great Wall. It was a titanic engineering job, and also a lot of people gave their lives to do that project. But it solved one of the deep problems of Chinese history up to that time. It created a barrier against these nomadic raiders from the north, whose raids into Chinese territory had been a constant of Chinese history. So he did that, and he did, and he did a bunch of other things. He really organized a tightly controlled, centralized empire. And then he died, and because he had been so ruthless and so big in his schemes and so kind of brutal in carrying them out, on the one hand, he turned a whole bunch of warring, disparate little kingdoms into one governable empire. And on the other hand, as soon as he died, the eruption of resentment just swept out his supposed heir. So his dynasty was 1.5 people long. But the little bit of disorder, I'm sure they didn't think it was little at the time, because it's still war. But it was just a few years, and when the smoke cleared, there was another emperor, different dynasty. A peasant had risen up to that highest height, and he started the foundational dynasty of Chinese culture, which is the Han Dynasty, and he was able to carry out the projects that he would need to carry out to build a coherent civilization, because Mao had done, not Mao, excuse me, the first emperor had done the dirty work. He had done those things that really couldn't be done without, I don't know if they could or couldn't, but he did things that required tough, brutal, authoritarian effort. And then the next dynasty could profit from that by being softer, gentler, kinder, and still have a tax code that absolutely regulated everything that went on in the empire and so on. So that's something that happened around a couple of centuries before Common Era. And then the Han Dynasty fell apart, and there was another period of chaos. And how that ended was another very Mao-like figure who emerged out of the smoking chaos, and he did the same thing as Mao. He undertook a huge infrastructure project, which was building the Grand Canal, which connected North China and South China. and solved another huge problem of Chinese history and enabled,
Hmm.
this prosperous, huge, booming empire to then emerge. That guy also, the brutality of what he did ended up sweeping out his his son and heir. He and his son were both like,
Don't be the son of a brutal emperor.
yeah. So then came the Tang Dynasty, and they were like this long, enduring, cultured civilization. This thing has happened, a number of times in Chinese history. The Ming Dynasty was another case, and Mao came to China after a period in which China was in one of those times when it had fallen apart and fragmented. From the outside, we would say, well, European imperialism came in and they were a weak and corrupt civilization, and the much more developed and sophisticated Europeans took over. And then,
Who told that narrative, right?
colonial activity, and they shook off the European masters. But if you look at it from the pattern of Chinese history, the Chinese historians of 2,000 years ago already had this scheme in which they said there is periods of order and periods of disorder. And in the periods of disorder, the barbarians start to press in. But it's not because of the barbarians, it's because something has gone wrong internally.
Hmm.
So the success of the barbarians is a mark of something that has to be corrected internally. So the 19th century was a period of warring states or chaos and disorder for China, and the early the first half of the 20th century was a civil war that was the empire trying to reconstitute itself. When Mao emerged from that, you saw those same huge infrastructure projects thing that he did,
Hmm.
and he completely reorganized, Chinese society. Although, the way I see it, there is this strain in Chinese culture that goes way back, which is the idea of the scholar bureaucrat.
Hmm.
It's like uh, the administrators of the realm are people who are uniformly well educated in a doctrine that puts them all on the same page as they govern and administer the affairs of the empire. For those earlier emperors, it was Confucius and then Neo-Confucian. Uh, I don't want to say ideology. It's like the
Uh-huh.
system of thought. And now it's Maoism. Or under Mao it became Maoism.
Right.
Everybody had that little red book they could quote from. But it was still the case that the empire was governed by a class of experts whose right to govern came from their mastery of the doctrine of the learning, which now is Maoist communism. And then Mao died. There was a period of disorder, and they're trying to sort out who was going to be
Hmm.
the next, how the succession would go. But it seems to have settled into some kind of communist party. It's like it's not Mao's communist party;
Right.
it's a peculiarly corporate communist party. Um, but it seems to have, it's possible. Who can predict? But it's possible that China is in for another period of stability, grandeur, and power.
Right.
Uh, and again, it's like its whole history. China has not really been a, um, a country or an empire that has uh, that has gone out and conquered, in the way that say Genghis Khan did or
Hmm.
Napoleon or something. Its expanding control and power seems to be, as a feature of that civilization, uh, to be carried out with trade, economic, you know, uh, vigor, and then cultural expansion. So I think that looks like it looks to me like it's happening again.
Again,
Yeah.
it's. I mean, obviously they've come down and influenced Vietnam and Korea and Japan, but the history you mentioned, the thing about Japan, why it is that Japan has never really been completely taken over, even though in the 7th century or so, the Japanese adopted Chinese versions of Buddhism and etc., so that they took on the culture. But has China ever really conquered Japan?
No, China's never.
Yeah, and Japan
It's kind
Japan
of
made
been
its
more the
move.
other way,
Yeah,
actually.
Japan made its move in the other direction, which was
Yeah,
pretty bold, as you say. But it was during a time of chaos
yeah.
that
Well, you
encouraged
know
the
that
barbarians, right?
I think it was that first emperor sent a fleet to Japan to conquer it,
Mhm.
and a storm came up and destroyed the fleet. So that was the end
That was
of
the end
that.
of that one. Never do that again, right? um, so another big chunk of history that you talk about are the Crusades,
Yeah,
and now we've got these Europeans. They are living on land that used to be part of the Roman Empire, and even north of that, which had never been conquered, although England had. But that whole area, and it was the backwater culturally,
yeah,
and then we had all the plagues, which caused even more problems for that area. So that the Crusades, you talked about them in several different ways, which were interesting. One, that the Europeans came and got a taste of a better culture, actually, or a more advanced culture, and
yeah,
and the end result of that, which I found a fascinating idea you had, is that in right around 1500 or so, that you had this advanced Islamic culture, you had an advanced Indian culture, the Mughal Empire, which was another Muslim culture. You had the Persian advanced culture right in between them, the three cultures, and then you had China also, all in pretty good shape at that time. The only ones that weren't in good shape were the Europeans, and so they took a totally different narrative from the plague and the reaction to the plague. Not that we want to talk about a plague during the coronavirus
please.
thing, because this doesn't really qualify as a plague, but
Oh,
at least we might have a little more feeling for what might have happened then. So
yeah.
I thought that was interesting because you said it created nostalgia for the past in the advanced civilizations, and it created an energy to go out and have an adventure and conquer new things in the backward one.
Well, the advanced civilizations east of the Mediterranean, and I use that as a shorthand because the Islamic culture wasn't all east of the Mediterranean; it was also all along North Africa and into Spain. But uh, for whatever your shorthand is, all of those cultures, uh, they were doing just great, and then this business of the trickling down effect of the steppe nomads
Hmm.
began to hit all of them. And what earlier when I was looking at these at the history of this time period and this geographical area, I was seeing it as I think most historians do, as a bunch of different stories. There was the Ghaznavids came down and sacked India, and that was a story. And then there was all this kind of turmoil on the Chinese border, and there were these crusades that started up. And when I was looking at the map, I realized, wait, these are not a bunch of different stories.
Yeah.
This is a story that's happening in one geographical zone, which is the entire belt of frontier between the steppe nomads of the north and the urban civilizations of the south. Um, and something happened up there. It's like something happened that that started a fervor and a kind of a boiling, energy out of the areas that we're now calling, Kazakhstan and uh, southern, southeastern Russia, and just
Hmm.
that whole area. Um, and so then when you look at that closely, you discover, oh, wait a minute. Uh, there was a precipitating episode. The
Hmm.
precipitating episode was the birth of Russia.
Hmm.
Russia was born, and all of a sudden there was this big plug between the steppe nomads on the eastern side and the European plains on the western side. With this plug in place, you weren't going to get any more of this nomads coming east and then trickling down into Italy and Greece. That wasn't going to happen now. They were bottled up. So when nomadic people are bottled up in one place, they push someplace else, and that's looks to me like what happened. It's like this bottling happened, and then this pushing out. But the the eruption that mattered on that side wasn't really the Crusades. It was the Mongol, conquests,
Yeah.
which came out of nowhere. It was one of those. Well, I mean, probably came out of somewhere, but for people for people near that area, it was like, what happened? Who are these guys? This is one of the black swans of history.
Yeah.
These plagues in Europe, the most important one, the Black Death, also happened because of that eruption of the Mongols. But of course, nobody at the time connected it that way because, the Europeans hardly even knew about the Mongols. They were frightened for a moment because the Mongols came almost to the gates of, they were going to attack, and then they, for some reason, went away.
Yeah.
But so when the plague came, I don't think any European thought of it as having anything to do with something happening elsewhere. But there's many things you can say, but one of the things you can say is when something like the Black Death sweeps through a civilization, it kills all the people but leaves all the infrastructure intact.
Hmm.
Whereas when the Mongols swept through all the places they sacked, they burned down the entire city of Baghdad and its 500,000 volume library.
Hmm.
They took all the library of the city of Balkh and threw it in the Oxus River. So there were so many books that dammed up the river. So there was a destruction of what energizes a civilization. In Europe, it's almost like they reduced the population, cleared out the old social forms that were kind of holding the static feudal European one big Catholic Church kind of structure. They broke it open, and Europe could expand now. Now it could just flex itself. Europeans were now, whereas on the other side of the Mediterranean over there, what people were experiencing is, wait, what happened? Let's get back to what we were doing.
Mm.
We were just rudely interrupted. We're not looking. We're not looking for the new because we had something good going on.
Right.
I think in Europe they were saying, let's go back to what, serfdom? Everybody's a serf? No, I think not.
I think not. I think
Let's
not.
try
Yeah.
something different.
Another thing I wanted to talk about, and somebody's already brought the question in, was you mentioned several African empires, Nubian
Yeah.
Empire and a couple of Islamic empires. You said one of the guys leaders was the richest man in the world at his time. And maybe you can tell a little bit about that because that part of history isn't told too often.
Well, it isn't told too often, and I wish I knew more about the history of sub-Saharan Africa. That's what we don't hear about very much nowadays, and
Yeah.
and I don't know if the research is there. But the parts that I'm talking about are the cultures that were flourishing just south of the Sahara Desert,
Hmm.
and uh, apparently there was a great source of gold down there someplace.
Hmm.
And it was further south than where these people were living. It was in the equatorial rainforest, I guess, or someplace down there.
Hmm.
Wherever it was, the Muslim people along the North African coast, they could get across the desert on their camels. They were able to do that.
Hmm.
On their camels, they couldn't go further into Africa and get to where the gold was. So this gave an opportunity for the African people south of the Saharas to build trading empires there. And there was many things that were traded, but the core of that trade was the gold salt trade. The people of the north had salt, and the people of the south had gold.
Hmm.
And so, so they had a trading relationship that featured this peculiar thing of, the people from the north would come and put all their stuff someplace and retire, and then if the people from the south thought it was enough, they'd leave the gold and take the goods. If it wasn't enough, they'd leave, and the people had to come and put more goods. They didn't actually talk to each other at first, but because of this trade, what happened is that there was cultures just south of the Sahara that emerged and became very powerful in their area. And there was a series of empires down there. The first one was Ghana, which incidentally was not where the modern country of Ghana is. It was further north and inland. and it was, a big flourishing, powerful empire. It gave way to the Songhay, which was even bigger and more powerful. I think that's when people began converting to Islam in that empire. And then an even bigger, then they were conquered by the Mali, and that was an even bigger empire. And that was really a Muslim, a Muslim
Hmm.
culture there now. And Mansa Musa was the emperor of the Mali Empire. He went to Hajj. He went on the pilgrimage to Mecca,
Hmm.
and that's when he took along so much gold that the market for gold actually crashed where he was where he was traveling when he went through Egypt. So yeah, before Jeff Bezos, I think he was the richest man who had ever lived.
Yeah, I think Jeff could crash our economy too by just shutting down,
Yeah,
especially right now. Um,
yeah,
One of the things that you talk about in Destiny Disrupted, which I found very interesting, was the background of the Wahhabi faith and the Saud family, and
yeah,
how deep that goes. A couple hundred years. It's not brand new. It's not what a lot of people think. Began at the beginning of the 20th century or something like that. That this combination between a family that wanted to rule and a family that wanted this religious approach. And that the families intermarried. That whole story is very fascinating because, of course, it brings us right to Bin Laden and what's going on, or what happened at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st. So,
Well, the Ibn Wahhab was the Muslim reformer.
right.
I say reformer. I'm referring to a period when uh, I think the precipitating factor was the success of European imperialism in the Muslim world.
Mm-hmm.
And Ibn Wahhab was one guy who grew up in the desert. He was a Bedouin, culturally, he came from Bedouin stock. Then he went out to, I guess, Egypt, I think it was, or, Cairo, the cities, the wealthy cities of the Muslim world. And he looked around, and it's like his feeling was, it's all corruption out here.
Mm-hmm.
We had something better in the desert where we weren't. We were more egalitarian. We were all these things. So he went back and he, you know, uh, launched this reformist version of Islam that was very, very exacting in terms of its narrative that the weakness of the Muslim world stemmed from the abandonment of original Islam. So then the core of his philosophy was Muslims have to live exactly like the Prophet did and his companions in the original Muslim community in Medina. Um, so that's a very
In order to regain power for the Muslims, basically.
yeah, in order to regain power, because they've lost the favor of God
Right.
by abandoning the original Muslim way. Uh, and then there was various, tribal chieftains who were looking for, to gain power, but the Saudi family, that was when they formed that alliance
Mhm.
with Ibn Wahhab and the Wahhabis. Then that was a powerful combination. They were able to prosper and conquer and bring other tribes into their under their power. That original combination didn't found, a powerful the powerful state that emerged later because they were within the Ottoman Empire,
Mm.
and when they tried to go up against the Ottoman forces, they were too small and
Right.
pitiful. But then later in the 20th century, and that alliance had endured, and now the Ottomans were weak, and that whole empire is falling apart. So then uh, the enduring combination of the Wahhabi clerical establishment and the Saudi tribal aristocracy, who had intermarried and were pretty connected, that turned out to be, for the circumstances and in the context, a powerful and successful combination. And their ascent was not unrelated to uh, the World War that was happening
Right.
and the British involvement. The British were, Lawrence of Arabia was involved in promoting that dynasty. It's interesting to me that it's only recently that the head, whether they're the king or whether they're the prime minister, it's only recently that another generation has come to power in
Mhm.
Saudi Arabia. Until very recently, they were still the children of the original founder of the pre-World War One
Yeah,
period,
there's a
because
very
that guy had many kids.
he did, and so did everyone since then. So one of the that reminds me, you're talking about this family, and I think it's really valuable for us with either our foreign policy or dealing with this to understand how deep those roots go and the connection. And when we say, well, you should just get rid of those guys, it really doesn't work that easily.
No.
To the Sauds, you can't just say you have to stop being this strict faith. You have to be something that we can deal with. It's just a non-starter in the negotiation. But we'll go to another period of time, 1850. In 1850, you had this great map, and it seemed to show that 9 different families, basically, ran at least half of the world. I think I counted it right. There was like 9 families, and they really, it was at the time of the British Empire, so that took a big chunk. But there were really only 9 other families that were running almost everything at the time. And
Yeah.
you showed how, in a way, the disintegration to 195 nation states, there were a lot of complicated things. But that's a little bit like the disintegration in China between the time of order to the time of disorder. So it's not too surprising that we had all these world wars. They were all part of the process. But I thought that was a really nice vision. 1850, this is the map. 60 years later, that all gets dissolved. Almost all of them were gone. The British monarchy lasts, but it's not really a monarchy. It doesn't run the world anymore.
Well, in that earlier map when it was 9 families, and I'll just toss out, it's like the Ottoman family ruled a whole bunch of stuff. The Romanov family ruled all of Russia. The Austro-Hungarian dynasty over there, and the German Hohenzollern. So those were empires that were dynastic, and there were only a few of them, but they were very loose and disorganized within them. It's like the emperor or the king or whoever was the head guy in a family-ruled empire like that. He didn't have that much to do with lots of technically his citizens or his subjects all over his empire. Everybody was ruled by their family ruler, who was ruled by another family ruler, and on up. These 195 nations, or however many it is, I'm not going to
Close enough.
say that's how many, but something like that. These nations, the difference between a nation and those empires, nations they're like hard nuggets. And when you went from one of those empires to another, there was checkpoints and stuff, but it wasn't that clear when you'd left one empire and entered another one. But it's not like that with nation states. You walk across a sidewalk and you're in the other country. And I would say that, all of my lifetime, I thought we had gotten to the final form. Nation states is what the world was about.
Right.
Now I think it's looking like that wasn't final. Something different is coming in.
Yeah. You have a really great analysis of that. You show how there's several different forces coming in. One was that during the 20th century there was this communist versus capitalist combination. Something that's ironic because well before Russia was communist or anybody was communist, Henry Adams wrote a book where he explained that the next century would be a competition between America and Russia. Russia being this sort of slow-moving thing that just keeps spreading everywhere, and America being this kind of very energetic, and are we going to take over everything?
Yeah.
So the prediction was right. The forms that it took were different. But then you said that this has gotten a new element, which is the Islamic Revolution going on. Let me go back to one other thing from a little bit earlier that I thought was fascinating, and is a very contemporary question to ask. You talk about India India is right on the line between the Hindu culture, which you said has this particularly unusual narrative, which is that everything is an illusion, and that this is the way that it's a fundamental idea in life, and yet there's all these strict rules about caste and everything. And then the Muslim conquering of them, the Mughal Empire was totally, India was run by Islamic civilization. But now we have a situation where there's, 300 million or so Muslims and 800 million Hindus in this one country. We've already had the big problem after the British left, where the Muslims went off to Pakistan and what's now Bangladesh, which was East Pakistan. And you've got a situation where you used the word, which you coined, I believe, bleshing. Both blending and meshing together, bleshing. And you sort of don't seem to have any confidence that the Muslim narrative and the Hindu narrative can blesh in a way that can run a society. And so what's going on in India with Modi and the push for more Hinduism and so on and so forth, or at least that some of their rights might be lowered, that's all part of the narrative you're talking about, this sort of competition in this space where it comes up against these two huge narratives. And so I want to know what you feel about how confident you are that something can be worked out better, or you think nothing can be really figured out between the two.
Well, the process for which I have coined the term bleshing doesn't go with the term working something out.
Okay, yeah.
Working something out is what is what organized entities do. What one government works something out with another government. Bleshing is in a place where two civilizations, cultures, narratives overlap. Individual people will find themselves swimming through a lot of ideas that don't necessarily quite fit together. And they will try to think, well, how does this fit with that? And they'll try to build a life that will make sense to them. And they might end up borrowing a little from here and a little from there. And in the course of time, what will emerge is something that isn't either of the previous separate narratives. It'll be some new narrative that has bits of the old, bits of the new, bits of each old one, and has dropped a few.
You have a great example of that in Buddhism. That early Buddhism, that it was this one kind of austere idea, and then it came in with the Bodhisattva ideas, which came from another area, and that created a new thing. But anyway, that was one of your examples of
Chan Buddhism in China was like this new thing that came in, and it had some Taoism in it, it had some Buddhism. Yeah. In India, the possibilities of that happening are reduced by the fact that there is something so contradictory about those two narratives. It's like very central to Islamic. The spirit of Islam is get rid of all the false gods. There's only one God. That's like, I would say, the most core element of Islam, and the ultimate ideas of Hinduism are also Unitarian, I would say, because everything converges to a final unity that's characterized by the term Atman, Brahman. But the spirit of everyday Hindu practice of religion is perfectly fine with everybody having different gods, so that's going to be hard to reconcile. And but then also, the Islamic presence in India has totally been one of conquest that had a lot of sacking of temples. Was part of the central thing. And when the experience historically is one group is coming in and focusing on sacking the religious most sacred things of the other group, it's going to be a hard time before that. That's going to be hard to reconcile. I think that in the course of modern times in Indian history, the the secular idea of Nehru and of Gandhi
Hmm.
was the possible hope for building something that was able to accommodate both Islam and Hinduism. Uh, it didn't succeed. It's like the separation of Pakistan and India was one of the most
Hmm.
horrifically dramatic moments in the history of that kind of separation.
Hmm.
So many people gave their lives over just a few weeks, and
Hmm.
that as the two populations tried to scramble to the other side of those lines. And now, I think what uh, the the fundamentalist Hindu party in India is not uncharacteristic of fundamentalist authoritarian movements all over the world. And I think it's a reaction to, in part, it's like there's a lot of things going on, but I think one of it is that the march of technology and the expansion of all cultures, trading relationships, and everything has created a space known as the human culture of the planet,
Hmm.
in which there are many narratives operating, and all of us are apt to be brushing against and be in some contact with other narratives. And to the extent that it is the case that from within one narrative it's very hard to understand the other narrative from its own context. You can
Hmm.
understand bits of it, but you take it into your narrative and make it part of your narrative, and then you don't really have those bits of that narrative. You have, you're sort of, and so, um, and so as these cultures try to merge, uh, the incoherence has um, has a propensity to drive people towards purifying their beliefs and getting with others of their own kind
Right.
and getting rid of the other. So I think we see a movement that way all over the world. Maybe it's not. I hope, and I have some positive belief that that's a phase we're going through. We're going to come to some world culture
Yeah.
on the other side of all this.
And that's we have time to focus on that for a little while. Part of the idea here was that we had all these four basic river civilizations, the nomads. We had other areas with other ideas, all these different separate histories, all these different narratives that had really fundamentally different ideas that weren't able to merge or blesh, as you say. At the same time, we have had overriding other narratives that sort of bring things together a little bit more, and we do see. As you said, there's always been interconnectedness, but the interconnectedness now is daily, and we obviously, everyone around the world knows exactly what's going on with the coronavirus everywhere in the world on a daily basis. So we have this interconnectedness. Do we have a common future? What is that basis of moving towards the common future? You mentioned the role corporations play, the role of things, but then you also brought this idea, and it's a Silicon Valley idea, if anything, and that is this singularity idea, which you describe and then say, I'm not sure I buy that. But there's this idea that we can all upload ourselves to computers and go on forever, which is an interesting, as you said, I think, an interesting new religion. So I think talk a little bit about how we can move and what you see as the principles that could help us build a common future where you undoubtedly must accept certain differences in different narratives and say that narrative is fine. That's your culture's consensus about how to live life. This is ours, but we all agree on the following things. And can we build something? Like you said about attempting it. But I think, as you said, in India, between Nehru and Gandhi and trying to build a secular framework to contain everybody. And we have some experience in America, but I think a lot of people don't realize how short our experience is, how short the experiences in other countries. You made a nice distinction between Europe and America on the nationalism. America was about ideas and nationalism was about race. And that was another fascinating part. People should read about that because we don't have time to cover it. But how the idea of race got started and racism, not that it got, everyone has always had the other, but to do it based on race was a relatively recent phenomenon. I thought that was a fascinating argument you made. But give us the idea of where you think, where your optimism comes from that we can build a common future, if you've got
Well, you know, as much as our experience is so constantly that the world is a mess, everything's falling apart. There's also every day, you know, we're doing one thing right now. Look, we had this pandemic, and now you and I are having this conversation, and other people are listening to it.
Yeah.
This is part of our human experience now, and I think on the spiritual side of building a common humanity, which is one of the, you know, you can't do without that. There has to
Right.
be some sense of emotional attachment or relationship to the oneness of humanity. Right now, this pandemic going on, there have been pandemics many times in history, and in terms of the catastrophic nature of them, way more than now. You know, it's like when the Europeans came to America, in many places, 9 out of 10 people died. So it's like unimaginable from where we are right now. But nobody in those times knew that was happening to people anywhere else. There's never been a time in history that we have had an experience like this where we're aware that all of us as humanity are facing some single threat that's not another human group. So
Yeah.
that the answer to it is not get the guns out, Charlie, let's go, start shooting. It's something different. We haven't quite figured out what, but you know, right now we're doing the social distancing and sheltering in place. But right with that, we're also trying to find ways to connect. You know, it's like Zoom conferences and
Mhm.
you know, I was thinking of making a lemon meringue pie and taking it over to my neighbor's house,
Yeah.
putting it on their porch, and then coming back and giving them a call and saying, "I left you a pie."
Yeah.
They did that for us with bread. Um, so I think, you know, I don't know, but I see some possible ray of bright side to what's happening right now. And the other part of the process, which is slowly building or weaving a narrative that we're all inside of, is not something anybody can do. It's
Mhm.
something that emerges from human culture as we interact. Um, I think what we have to believe in, or not even believe, I think this is a truth that we have to open our eyes to, is that having a single human narrative that we're all inside of, and you know, through which we can connect with all other humans, does not mean we have abandoned our differences.
Yeah.
You know, I think I've elsewhere given the analogy that you know, if you think of the human species as some single organism, which you really need to, because the interconnection through intercommunication, interaction of different human groups has an organic quality of setting intentions, pursuing goals, all of that. The fact that we as humans have many different cultures and many different ideas of how to, how to deal with our environment, essentially. That's a good thing about humans. You
Mhm.
know, that's the human animal having many different strategies. And we need to, because whatever we're dealing with out there, no matter how much we think we know, it's a big unknown. And things we can't even imagine or predict are constantly going to be coming at us from out there. The pandemic is one example. You know, it's
Yeah.
like 5 months ago, nobody predicted this.
No, and one of the nice things about it too, I think that there's always the idea that we have to hold on to our knowledge to be competitive with other places, and to really make sure nobody else learns. I mean, it wasn't too many centuries ago that men didn't want women to learn anything,
Yeah,
and
that's
never
right.
be educated, because what would happen if the women got smarter than we were? Well, now we know, because now they're educated and and it's an advantage. And the cultures
Yeah,
that don't do this are losing half of their resources, basically.
yeah,
But the other thing about the pandemic is that because the scientific medical knowledge has spread, there are probably 100 labs throughout the world in all different
yeah,
countries,
that's right.
all working on this vaccine, and also tests. And somebody's going to come up with a better test. Someone's going to come up with a better vaccine. It's all going to be scientifically tested first, and then we'll have that advantage. And it won't be an American. It could be from South Africa. It could be from Egypt. It could be from labs in any place in the world. We don't know.
Yeah.
Everybody's got that medical education, and that's an advantage to everybody. And I think it's really, at least should give us that idea.
Yeah, I agree.
I want to, even though it's a total aside, oops, got it. I want to, someone sent in a question, 2 questions, and so even it's an abstraction, it's away from what we're talking about, I wanted to ask him for that person. Didn't the Achaemenid dynasty initiate trade and ideas between Greece and India long before Alexander? And how is Cyrus pronounced correctly in Persian, just in case you know that? Those were the 2 questions. Cyrus in Persian?
I think Cyrus is pronounced Horush.
Horush, something like that.
I think that's how it would have been pronounced back then.
We're pretty close with Cyrus.
Alexander is late in the game for Achaemenid dynasty. There was, before Alexander, the Greeks were well aware of the Persians, and many Greeks went over there and had jobs and worked there and then came back. And the Persians were also aware of the Greeks for a long time. The Persians thought of the Greeks as frontier outliers, and that's probably why that trouble started, is because they kept trying to tell those frontiers people, you have to do this, you have to do that, obey the emperor. And they didn't probably quite appreciate that the Greeks had emerged as a power in their own right. The trade thing has always been operating right along with the opposite of it, which is building the frontier and attacking the other.
Right.
And they said that in the Achaemenid Empire, there were caravans of 100 camels and 200 camels constantly crisscrossing the realm, going to the much, the rich places that were on all sides of the Persian Empire. And when you look at that middle world, which, the heart of it is Persia, when you look at that middle world, it's surrounded by navigable bodies of water. So every place where you have a navigable body of water, you're going to have a port, and that's going to connect out to other places that are the ports for some hinterland. Mm-hmm. Persia was a trading society. That's what, that was the heart of the culture.
Yeah, and I think one of the things about that that's good for the future is, as you kind of show, one of the trajectories of human life is more trade and less war, even though the trade is often aggressive and like war, and the war is often not as aggressive sometimes and more like trade. But that we are interconnected, we're going to keep doing it, and it'll just keep speeding up, and we're going to deal with it one way or the other. We ought to do it intelligently, if we can.
Yes.
Anyway, that was great. Thank you very much, Tamim, for joining us this way. It was really a great conversation, wonderful book, and we'll see you live in September if everything works out.
Yeah, I hope it does, and thank you for inviting me here.
My pleasure. So ends another event of the Commonwealth Club in its 118th year of enlightened discussion. Thank you very much for joining us.